Good evening, and welcome to our panel discussion entitled Anti-Racism, the Solution or Part of the Problem. My name is Alan Katz, and I'm the founder and CEO of American Public Square at Jewell, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us for this first in our Race and Identity series, which we're proud to co-host with our partners at The Forward. I would like to thank our program and presenting sponsors, including Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, PlexPod, and William Jewell College. Now, during our program, we welcome requested fact checks and questions for our esteemed panel. Please utilize the Q&A feature of Zoom or comment on the Facebook live stream to ask questions or to request a fact check. Our fact checkers tonight are APS Student Initiative Coordinator, Allison Kelzer, and APS Student Intern from Emory University, Priya Jean-Baptiste. Batya Ungar-Sargon, Opinion Editor at The Forward. It was her impactful piece, A New Intelligentsia is Pushing Back Against Wokeness, that prompted tonight's panel. You all have access to that article on the American Public Square program page for tonight's event. Batya will be asking questions submitted by you. In fact, with that, allow me to turn it over to Batya to make a few remarks.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Ambassador Katz. I'm Batya Ungar-Sargon, the opinion editor of The Forward. On behalf of The Forward, we are so delighted to welcome you here tonight and to partner with American Public Square for this exciting first program in our joint Race and Identity series. As Alan mentioned, I will be watching for and curating your questions for tonight's panelists. So make sure you use that Q&A feature on Zoom and give us your questions and your fact checks. We're going to take them very seriously. With that, I will turn it over to American Public Square's Program Director, Denisha Snell, who will serve as moderator for tonight's event.
Thank you, Batya, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. In the wake of the George Floyd murder, the call for racial justice and equity has become amplified and widespread across our nation. One possible solution is the anti-racist theory made popular by authors Ibram X, Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. But there is a new Black intelligentsia pushing back against the notion that race is the defining category of life in America. I am pleased to welcome thinkers from both sides of that perspective tonight. Let's welcome our panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Isaac J. Bailey, a journalist and Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Second, we have Kmele Foster, co-founder of Freethink and host of the Fifth Column podcast. And third, we have John McWhorter, a professor of linguistics at Columbia University. You can find our panelists' full bios at the American Public Square event webpage. Welcome to each of you. And before we get started, I want to say one quick thing. Though we did not hear back from him, I did extend an invitation to Ibram X. Kendi to join us tonight because his writing has popularized the anti-racist theory. I have no doubt, though, that you all will represent well this evening. So let's get started. So in order for us to get started, I think it would be useful for us to do some level setting around definitions and terms that are likely to come up during tonight's discussion. So I want to start with you, John. From your perspective, can you define the expressions anti-racist and woke for our viewers tonight?
Well, I think it's important to realize that by woke, what's meant is that a person understands the operations of racism in society beyond what would be intuitive. And so woke is not just understanding that a person might be what used to be called prejudiced. To be woke is to understand that prejudice and then the societal disparities that prejudice can actually affect in the aggregate mean that you have to understand that racism has effects beyond calling someone the N-word or someone who doesn't want to hire Black people or something like that. You have to be woke to that. So to be woke is to be part of a kind of contingent of unusually enlightened people. And anti-racist means that as well. So the idea in terms of how we use it, as opposed to what you might see in a dictionary, if that word has been in the dictionary until very recently, is that you don't like what used to be called prejudice. And who does, frankly? You know, almost nobody would admit to being in favor of prejudice, and very few people are. But anti-racist means that you are committed to the eclipse of the effects of racist bias in society that mean that the playing field is not entirely level for Black people. And there's a general implication, both with woke and with anti-racist, that these are concepts that take a certain amount of initiation to understand, and that therefore there's a certain, I'm not going to call it indoctrination, but there's a certain very careful, I will call it Karate Kid-like kind of introduction to the profundities and the subtleties of these matters. That's what is meant by these things, not what you would find in the dictionary, but what people mean, whether or not they're consciously aware of it or not.
Excellent. Okay, so Isaac and Kmele, I want to hear your response to John's answer.
I'll happily jump in there. I think that most of that I would completely agree with. I think another specific word that's worth defining in terms of the anti-racist lexicon is just the word racism, which historically we would generally use that and we would refer to things that people believe about different racial groups. But a major thrust of the anti-racist paradigm is that racist is better understood as a reality, a milieu that we exist in, and specifically that any system that generates racially disparate outcomes, that is to say that, you know, Blacks are more likely to go to prison or are less well off economically, any sort of systematic outcome disparity like that, those systems are by definition racist. And I think that redefinition becomes very important, considering when you reference someone's work like Kendi's. I think something from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is the defining question is whether the discrimination, is creating equality or inequality. If discrimination is creating equality, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequality, then it is racist. And this equality and inequality has everything to do with racial disparities, with whether or not particular groups, specifically minority groups, are being less well represented in various sort of outcomes.
Excuse me. Like, yes, like, and like, I don't, I'm sort of like fully like disagree with like anything that was said there, like, except for the fact that like I sort of actually came, at least like across these terms, actually from young people, and then that like their goal, like was to like actually try to be engaged on like these issues. And also at least to like actually try to think at least beyond themselves. I mean, yes, and so like for them, like it actually was a like very, very positive and active kind of like sort of like thing to do. And then that like at least sort of that when it had like somewhere like along the way, like it actually got like it actually got sort of actually turned on its head, like at least by the critics. But yes, and so like for me still, at least like actually with these sort of like and sort of at least like actually with these folks that I still like actually deal with and teach, etc., that like this is a positive move, like in order to like, actually try to affect real positive change. But yes, like, and also that like it is not an indoctrination, and also well, yes, like also, yes, I guess that at its finest, like, and yes, like, and sort of at its core, like it is really about sort of actually trying to speak up for like for sort of like folks who are still struggling, essentially. I'm like, so like for me, like that is how like I still like see it, like, and sort of like actually talk about it, like I'm like, even now.
Excellent. So with that being said, and with you saying that it was a chance for young people to have positive change or affect change, for each of you, how has the anti-racist theory moved the needle for America?
Well, I think that it has created a very interesting moment where more non-Black Americans than ever before, and in such a short time, are thinking about their responsibility, if they have one, for the plight of Black America. There's an idea that if you are white, you are by definition and by your very getting out of bed, complicit in a system's oppression of Black people. I openly think that that is a vastly exaggerated, devastatingly simplistic, and grievously pernicious way of looking at it. But it is not intended as manipulative. It's not cynical. It's not anybody lining their pockets. It's a misled perspective that I think I understand. And it's something that people are really thinking about. Now, I think that many people would say that America is finally coming to terms with race. I don't think so, because I think that the way we're being taught how to think about what's being called anti-racism and wokeness is one that unintentionally infantilizes Black people, for one thing, and also is only connected to an activist political imperative in an abstract and performative way. And it doesn't matter that people who are interested in this sort of thing talk about what something affects or what something functions to do. That's just language. What we're really concerned with is whether or not these things lead directly and with all deliberate speed to grassroots efforts to improve the lives of poor Black people right now. Instead, what I see is an awful lot of what the people in question don't know is a kind of open-ended performance art that doesn't make anybody any less poor, whatever it functions to do. And so it worries me. However, nevertheless, if we can get from the moment that we've been in since June and July to a wider awareness among white and other non-Black Americans that there are things that can be done that can help poor Black people become less poor and maybe even diminish the amount of subtle racist bias that there is in society, although frankly, I don't find that as important as many people seem to, then I think that we're in a good place. It's been a very peculiar and very performative and very inwardly focused 2020. And I think more people need to understand the nature of that.
Kmele, Issac, has it moved the needle? Or any response to John?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a change, and we can focus, as John did, on 2020. The thing that really stands out to me is that there is obviously a great deal of interest and energy and passion around issues of race and racial justice. There's an entire language that people are learning. There is a determination, it seems, to really learn exactly what's going on. And I think amongst many people, a real desire to not be sort of left behind. One of the things that really struck me about the way things have unfolded since this summer is the degree to which this has sort of overtaken what seems to be like the whole of society, at least when it comes to sort of media, which is the space that I operate in, the degree to which you can't turn on a cable news broadcast without having someone engage in this practice of recasting particular issues with respect to race and racial justice. Even the principal issue that we've talked about this year, at least sometimes it seems like the principal issue of the COVID pandemic, is something that we've talked about in many instances as with respect to its presumed, and in some places explicitly stated, disproportionate impact or particular impact on members of different racial groups, particularly minorities and particularly African Americans and Hispanic Latinos. But I think that also underscores what I think is wrong and what's happening here that makes me most concerned. And it's that all of this energy and enthusiasm is more like sort of fetishism The thing that we seem to be lacking in a lot of our conversations about race and racial justice is a real sort of rigorousness, a genuine curiosity. Supposition tends to dominate most of our conversations. George Floyd is a name that comes up a lot, as is Breonna Taylor. And in a lot of these instances, and I know we're going to talk about criminal justice a little later, there are presumptions about the factors that led up to those circumstances happening. And the actual search for evidence, questions about whether or not, all things being equal, if George Floyd had been a white man, the same bad outcome could have happened to him in his interaction with law enforcement. And for me, the obvious answer is yes. For me, when I look at the data, it's hard to ignore the fact that Black people and white people have bad outcomes when it comes to policing. And that in a universe of other issues like the pandemic, the thing that is most predictive of your likelihood of not only contracting this, but succumbing to this illness is your age and not your race. To the extent this tendency to think about race first, to use it as the principal frame for understanding all sorts of complex realities that we live in, to the extent it makes it harder for us to actually acknowledge that complexity, I think that's a very bad thing. And that's something that we ought to be very concerned about.
Well, yes, though that I am frankly ecstatic that finally that there actually seems to be this energy among white people to actually finally deal with this issue in a serious way. I am a Black dude here in South Carolina, and I've been dealing with these issues for a very, very long time here in this state. And one of the most difficult parts about this struggle here has been at least to actually try to get white people here at least to actually acknowledge racism, and also to actually say that maybe just maybe that yes, in terms of that these kinds of disparities, et cetera, are real, and also to actually try to get them to do something about race. And so for me, I have seen this explosion, and it has been energizing. Excuse me. Yes. Well, yes, and yes, and for example, I saw yes, I was actually invited at least actually to this sort of book study at this white church, and all of these older sort of white folks here. They actually started off with actually reading A New Jim Crow, et cetera, and moved on. Yes, it's yes, et cetera. Yes, and then after that, yes, and then that they actually they actually started actually did sort of research on sort of crime and arrests, et cetera, all of those things in our area. Yes, and then sort of after that, yes, and then that yes, and then that yes, and then that they sort of actually pulled this sort of this sort of nonprofit together, just to actually rail excuse me, and sort of at least to actually raise sort of bail funds actually for that residents here. And so for them, yes, in terms of that, they sort of were actually taught things that they sort of actually did not know. They actually got energized about it, and also took real action, which is actually, which is actually really, really helping real people. Yes, and so for me, I've actually seen that going on, and also sort of yes, that I can say that there sort of actually have been missteps and extremes, et cetera. Yes, of course. And then that like that is true of sort of like every single movement in history. Yet though that like for at least for me, yes, in terms of that, like in terms of that, like I sort of like actually have been waiting like actually for a period like this, like in order to get white people to wake up.
So I'm going to put a pin in a couple of things that you all have said. The open-ended performance art, the fetishization of Black folks and minorities, and then Isaac will come back as well to church, because I think that's a really interesting perspective as well. The one thing, though, that I think is unique about us sitting here, and in my mind, being able, for those of us that identify as Black on this call or on this Zoom, is the unique fact that I'm sitting here and it's almost like I'm talking to my brothers. And so if I was to say this is going to be successful, it would be that I'm giving people the opportunity to sit in my living room with my brothers and I and have this conversation. So here's what we want to talk about next. What is it like to be Black in America, right? We want to talk about identity. How is identity shaped by race? Isaac, I'm going to start with you. Talk a little bit to us about what it means to be Black in America, and then John, we'll send that over to you.
Well, yes, and like for me, like it is like often better, at least to like explain race, like actually by someone actually trying to step out of it, for instance. So like for me, like I am a stutterer, like I am a severe stutterer. Like I've been, I'm at least like one for ever. I mean, yes, and so like for me, like I got it. Well, yes, in terms of that though, that I sort of like actually have like this unique personality and background and insight, etc. Like all of those things are still true about me, like as an individual, right? And yet though, I am also a stutterer. And then so, yes, and then that like there are sort of that other stutterers, like who sort of like backgrounds are different, etc. Insights are different, etc. And yet though, like we actually have sort of like this sort of like one thing in common, like at least like in which that like at least like in which that like we sort of like actually have to navigate this world as stutterers, and you don't. Yes. Yes, and again, yes, in terms of that, like our sort of that on that uniqueness, sort of like is going to like actually make our journey different. Like at least by individual. And yet though, like our sort of common struggle is like actually still with this stutter. And then so like for me, it is the same thing. So actually, when it comes to race, when it comes to being Black in this country, like whereas that, like at least with us here, really on this panel, that like we are unique individuals with like with sort of like different backgrounds and insights, etc. And yet though that yet though that each of us actually has to navigate this world. At least like like at least like actually excuse me, and sort of like at least sort of as we like are like actually trying to like actually like deal with this thing called Blackness, and sort of even if we do not accept that term, and yet though that like it is still something that like we all like share.
Okay, so Isaac, you're telling us that we still have to deal with Blackness, even if we don't identify as Black, just like you have to you're a stutterer and you present as a stutterer and you have to deal with that, whether you say I stutter or not. That's still something that you have to deal with. So John, let's hear what you have to say about this.
No. Isaac, I'm really sorry. No. I do not navigate as a Black man. I live as a Black man in the 21st century. I remember a little chunk of the late 20th century. Racism exists, discrimination exists. I can tell you some stories, but it's just some stories. And for me to say that the little things that happen to me every now and then mean that I'm navigating the world as a Black man, personally, I would feel that I had been told to tell that story. Everybody has problems. Some people have more problems than others. And I know I'm dealing with very delicate ground here. And the only reason I'm even going to go here is because I'm a linguist, and so I know a little bit about it. But if I had a stutter, I would consider that to be a matter of navigation. That's tough. I've seen it. I know about it. It doesn't begin to compare with what it is to be Black in our times. Now, the issue of what happened in 1937 or even 1967 is irrelevant here. We're talking about today. No, I don't get it. And yes, that does include the police. And what Kmele was alluding to is that we have been sold a bill of goods about the issue of the cops and Black people. And I'm not sure if here we're going to get into the statistical arguments, but the simple fact of the matter is that the cops are horrible for all people. And I think the most memory-friendly way of dealing with this is just to consider that every time you hear about some hideous thing that the cops did to a Black person, usually a man, Breonna Taylor is a terrible story, but usually it is a man. Every time you hear one of those stories, there's no denying it. It's almost always something that shouldn't have happened. There is a white person that happened to often 4 or 5 months ago who we never heard anything about. And I'm not somebody who walks around complaining about the mainstream media having this obsession with, holding things back. Everybody is a human being doing their job, and we all operate according to biases. I certainly do. However, there was a white George Floyd that nobody wants to talk about. And for every case that you can name, there is, including Tamir Rice, there's a white version that just never made the news. And what that means is that the idea that Kmele and Isaac and John and Denisha walk around needing to think of ourselves in a metaphorical crouch against the operations of the cops because the cops are bigots deep down. Notice I said deep down, but still, it's not true. And frankly, I would think that we would be glad. The story is not quite as nakedly bigoted as we're told. The cops are undertrained murderers, sure. Is it about race? And this is so hard for people to accept when you say it. No, enjoy it, everybody. But no, we're not supposed to talk about that. So no, I'm with all due respect, Isaac, no, I do not navigate anything.
Okay, so Kmele, we know that you do not identify as Black, but I want you to talk about identity, and we'll come back to the police issue. But I want to talk about identity with you first. Tell us, agree, disagree, Isaac, John, what are your thoughts, Kmele, on what they've said?
Yeah, well, I think more specific than any of the things that they refer, just to take the premise question that there is a notion of Blackness, and that there is a fundamental experience of Blackness country. And I do think this kind of relates to the point that John was making. I want to hopefully add something a bit different here. I think there's something important to acknowledge about the reality that we all know we live, which is that we're individuals. It's been said by enough people that there is no one way to be Black. Barack Obama has said, a number of other people have, that there are as many ways to be Black as there are Black people. And this is a serious idea. If this is true, then it renders the notion of Blackness almost completely contentless and meaningless. The reality is that it is true that there's no one way to be Black, and that there's no one way to be shit. And that the differences between the groups that we imagine exist, that there are differences inside those groups, various codes that exist. to the extent we're reaffirming this notion of thinking about ourselves, about thinking about differences, about thinking about diversity, the fact that we are at a place where we imagine that the diversity of an institution is best understood by examining whether or not people are in that institution in proportion to the share of their racial groups, share of the population, is just obscene. Like, there are innumerable ways to think about diversity. Certainly when I think about diversity, I'm interested in diversity of perspective. It's entirely possible to have a room of people who look somewhat different from one another and think in very similar ways about materially significant issues. So I think it's very important for us to be able to remove those blinders. And the thing that most concerns me about the moment that we find ourselves in is the degree to which we seem to be intent on reifying the notion of race, intent on framing ourselves with respect to race. The fact that for the anti-racist, progress is understood as white people accepting and reckoning with their whiteness because they didn't imagine themselves as a particular racial group. The fact that it's routinely trotted out, Black men are more likely to be murdered by the police. This is a statistical reality that doesn't really map very well onto reading. Like, the truth of the matter is that I'm not particularly likely to be killed by the police for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with my pigmentation. And ignoring all of those things, ignoring all of those very real things in favor of an overly simplistic understanding of the way that the world works, because it's convenient, perhaps because it's elegant, because it seems to coincide with a particular understanding of the history of this country. That is very disadvantageous, and it's sort of thing that hijacks the very good intentions of many people who want to make the world a more just place, who have, unfortunately, embraced a worldview that prioritizes equality of outcomes, equity, over equality of the law, which is an imperfect ideal, this meritocratic ideal, but is among the highest achievements of our species, and is something that we should not take lightly.
Okay, so I see that we have, Isaac, were you going to respond really quickly? Because I see we have a lot of questions from the audience. So we'll hear from you, and then Batya will take it over to you for questions from the audience.
Sure. Yes, and I am a Black man in 21st century America, and I am a stutterer in 21st century America. Yes, and then that, what I know, is that, even in the stuttering world, that we are actually having this same kind of conversation, by the way. Yes, and because there are sort of factions, of the stutterers, who actually don't want to say that we are stutterers, but that we are people who stutter, etc. And also sort of they're sort of are sort of folks who sort of actually want us to actually be able to stutter freely, etc. Whereas that others sort of actually want us to always sort of actually be in therapy about it, just to be more fluent, etc. All those sort of things. Yes. Yes, and then that on that point that John is correct, in saying that my stutter actually has been yes, in terms of how much more challenging than my race. Yes. That is absolutely true, and I've said that to everybody everywhere. Yes, that is absolutely true, no question about it, for sure. Yet though that that sort of actually does not mean that my race doesn't matter. Yes, and also that frankly, if we can be honest here, yes, in terms of at least a part of the power of John's words, and also Kmele's, is the fact that like they yes, in terms of that, like they are sort of like labeled Black by others, like, and yet those sort of like actually deal with it in a different kind of way. Like, which is like also like, which is like also sort of like, this is like actually what I mean by sort of like actually navigating this world, like even in our uniqueness as well.
Okay, so let's go over to Batya. Batya, do we have any questions from the audience?
We do have a lot of questions. I think what I'll do is I'll read 4 of them. And I think there's sort of one for each of you here, but also very interesting to hear what you all think about each of these. So the first is, and I think this is a really interesting and important one, quite foundational. Do you all agree that racism has been and continues to be a huge problem in the US? And do you believe that structural or institutional racism exists? The second question I want to pose to you is, how can you say, so I guess this is more for Kmele and John, how can you say a hyper-focus on race is a problem today when a hyper-focus on race led to whites amassing great wealth, Jim Crow lynching, redlining, and many other problems? A hyper-focus on race in the past has caused many of the ills for the Black community. How should this be addressed if not by focusing on race? And there were a number of questions along these lines. A third question is about these anti-racist trainings. So it comes from a 28-year-old Black and Filipino male teacher in California. He's gone through a number of these mandatory anti-racist trainings, and what he says is he's noticed a lot of the situations presented for analysis are predicated on the assumption that the racist culprit is white. And his question is he wrong to worry about his white colleagues during these trainings? And he says, I can't help but feel that they are trying their best to fight racism, but by allowing stereotypes of themselves to fly unopposed. And then the fourth question I'll pose to you is also really interesting. Are folks who subscribe to the anti-racist theory concerned that the first wave of white acceptance of the theory is masking a larger pressure cooker of white and other individuals who are being forced to keep their mouths shut, but who ultimately will work against equality because they have been silenced and then rise up? And isn't this the argument for why Trump was elected, for example, that the working class, blue collar individuals were being suppressed by the elite?
The answer here is really this. The issue is not whether or not we should consider race to exist as a biological category, or whether or not we should consider that racist bias and also the playing field isn't level, racist inequity is the problem. Of course, we have to think about those things, but the idea that nobody thought about those things until last June is a fiction. These things have been quite an obsession among certainly the American intelligentsia and media and very much beyond for a good 40 years. The issue is the focus on race today and what we intend to do about it. So, let's say that in the past, there was a focus on race that created an affirmative action for whites and created the inequities we have today. Okay, so we're going to focus on race now. If that focus on race is going to mean predicating that Black people are these uniquely fragile creatures, as Robin DiAngelo's book does, if we're going to focus on race by pretending that it makes sense to say that all inequities that Black people suffer are due to white racism of some kind, that there's no such thing as a cultural trait that once made sense that ends up persisting beyond its expiration date, something that we allow as happening in all cultures in the world, but somehow think that if it happens among the descendants of African slaves, it's impossible that anything like that would ever happen. We pretend that social history isn't complicated. And instead, we listen to someone like Ibram Kendi saying that if Black people have less of something, if Black people aren't doing as well, it's because of racism, pure and simple. And everybody who listens to that knows deep down that it doesn't make any sense. But you learn that to address race, to return to this theme, is to pretend that things that don't make sense are some sort of higher wisdom, that it becomes a kind of religion, to take up one of my hobby horses. The thing is, that hurts Black people. So my question is not whether you're going to think about race. My message is not everybody think of themselves as an individual. That is not anything I've ever said or written. But the point is, what do you want to do for the people who need help? And if somebody's telling you instead to think of Black people as having IQs of about 35 and to treat you as if you have an IQ of about 45 by requiring that you believe that any problem Black people have is because white people don't like them or don't quite see them as human enough, then we have a problem. So yes, we have to think about race, but the question is how? And the way that you've been taught, you all, I don't even know who I'm referring to at this point because it's a lot of Black people too, how we're all being taught to think about race since the murder of George Floyd. Notice I said murder. I did think it was a murder. The murder of George Floyd is counterproductive, condescending, and frankly, I think that we're going to look back on 2020 as a good thing in that we got rid of the jackass. I mean, we actually got rid of the jackass. But we're going to look at the race debate this year, and I guarantee you that in 2030, a great deal of what we're going to dig up from the mainstream media and a lot of Zoom conversations, not this one, of course, are going to look desperately quaint. We need a much better way of addressing the ills of Black America than what we've got.
So let me, in response to that, let me ask you a quick question, because Batya did ask another point or another question that said, what about the things that were built on or that kept Black folks from getting and helped white people amass wealth, whether it was redlining, which, you know, I have my own experience with that via my parents, right?
It's real.
And so what about those issues?
In 2 sentences, because I don't want to take up too much time. All of those things can be fixed if we follow a brief slate, which I will talk about later, of things that Black America needs. But the problem is this: those 4 things do not include white America examining itself psychologically and seeking some sort of Judeo-Christian cleansing. That's just not what Black people need. And so, yeah, redlining was terrible. What are we going to do about it? It is not going to be this EST stuff that we're being taught, and it's not going to be that we're going to pretend to think that all Black problems are due to the fact that white people don't see us as whole. That's all.
Okay. Kmele, Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, I push back a little bit on what John framed up there, because I do think, I certainly appreciate, one, let me acknowledge, yes, racism has been a problem in America. I think it is far less problem today, and acknowledging remarkable progress we've made in this country somehow become almost somewhat taboo. The fact that we've had a president of the United States, Black billionaires are teaming this country, more billionaires in the United States than any place else on earth. These kinds of things are important. There's a question of sort of relative distribution, the share of wealth, persistence of various kinds of bad outcomes, underperforming education, et cetera. One wonders, the best way to talk about those things, to understand them, and to try and remedy them, to cast these issues with respect to race, and to focus primarily on the disparities between racial groups. So my first, I have a multi-response to this. I'll try to limit it to, the first part of it is with respect to appreciating what something like, say, illiteracy means for you if you are young and Black and you're in a poor, underperforming school. Is it more painful to be young and Black in that circumstance than it is to be young and white? Just open-ended question. Some might say yes, some might say no. Poverty, is it more painful to be Black and impoverished or white and impoverished? Illness, is it more awful for you to be white and to die from some malady versus being Black and dying from somebody? I'll leave those alone. But when it comes to remedying problems associated with those things, is a curriculum that improves outcomes for kids or some sort of system of education that improves outcome for kids likely to be more or less successful if we're thinking about race first? Are the solutions to poverty in this country, broadly speaking, for an impoverished person, things that actually depend on race in any sort of fundamentals? In most areas, I find that it is far better for us to think about the complicated social phenomena that is under duration, that is to obscure all of the really fine, nuanced, difficult things that are going on underneath the hood of society and producing bad outcomes, even outcomes that sort of having patterns to them. We're far better served by not allowing ourselves simply be sort of captured by race, and to allow our thing about race to completely hide our ability to understand these issues and to address them in a serious way. And I think far too often that has been the case. And again, here, even the framing of the question is something that is a bit distressing to me. I worry that we've spent a great deal of time talking about these issues with respect to race, time that would almost certainly be better spent focusing on the issues narrowly and in general, focusing on this generally so that we can actually benefit all people. Have difficulty with these issues, all children who find themselves in underperforming schools. That is a far better approach in my estimation, but it is something that seems to be losing ground.
Okay, so Isaac, go ahead.
Well, yes, and yes, so actually, just let's be very clear that it is not true that white people are the cause of all problems for Black people. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. Yes, and also that race isn't the only reason for racial disparities. It is not. Yes, fine. Yes. That is absolutely clear. And yet though that I sort of actually do not accept though yes, in terms of especially when I see these sort of deep-rooted sort of decades long disparities at least actually when it comes to the criminal justice system and the economy and education, etc. Yes, and so I'll actually just say, well, then that's all actually is only because at least actually when it comes to that white, at least actually when the Black people, yes, in terms of that, we aren't working hard enough or whatever. Yes, and so for me, that notion, which actually, by the way, golly, is a very, very real notion where I live. That is a very, very, it is a very, very racist notion. And also it actually actually lets our leaders and systems actually off the hook. Yes, and because even with my story, for instance, I sort of actually used to tell my story in order to actually get people to understand that even sort of folks like me, who actually grew up in some real tough situations, are sort of still also actually still sort of actually worthy of investment and second chances and redemptions, etc. And yet though, what I started to notice is that actually was this idea, just in terms of that, my story, of sort of of sort of resilience, etc. Yes, in terms of how stories are these will actually be used against other at least sort of at least sort of how at least at least against other folks like me who were actually still struggling. And so what I sort of actually had to do after that, I sort of actually had to change the conversation and like actually just like also like actually tell folks, yes, in terms of that, like I sort of actually needed food stamps, like I sort of like actually needed free lunches, like I sort of actually needed Pell Grants, like I sort of actually needed handouts, and yes, and also sort of at least like actually at least like all like this like actually like for like these kind of like broader systems, like in order to like actually help me get through. And so yes, and yet though that like at least for like many folks, I'm sort of, and especially here, yes, in terms of that, like they sort of actually see these disparities like as a sort of like deficit, like on sort of like Black people only.
Okay, so let me ask this really quickly, and I'm going to tie this into Isaac what you just said. John, you have said that we as Black Americans do not need anybody to think about being privileged over us. We do not need a psychological revolution in how white people feel. We frankly don't care that much how white people feel about us. In fact, you suggest that wokeness or anti-racism is a religion, especially as it pertains to white America. Why do you perceive people are signing up for this type of religious experience? And what is white America missing about Black folks?
That we have IQs over 35, and also that there is nothing about being a descendant of African slaves at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st that means that we cannot do basic things to help ourselves overcome, and that we can do it however white people feel about us in their hearts of hearts. And the issue here is not bootstraps. I'm not Booker T. Washington. I'm not saying that we're going to do it all ourselves. We need the government. We need programs. That's very important. But what people are talking about today is something far beyond that. What white people are getting out of this is they're assuaging their guilt. And I understand that. I can put myself in the head of a white person and I can imagine how attractive this whole rhetoric is. You feel bad, genuinely. And so you want to feel like you feel the right way. And to be quote unquote anti-racist has become a very handy way of showing that you're a good person. It's a replacement for showing that you have faith as a very devout Christian. Part of this is because fewer people are devoutly Christian, even openly, than they were, say, 100 years ago or even 200 years ago. And so I'm not saying that white people are maleficent in this, by no means. But unfortunately, there are an awful lot of Black people, mostly highly educated Black people, it's the media and the college town crowd, who would say that how white people feel matters, that they are injured if somebody looks at them funny or says something that suggests some slight degree of stereotyping, all sorts of little things that white people might do. I see them. I know what people are talking about. The idea is that you're supposed to fall to pieces. And so, for example, to take a very quick thing, the N-word. If you're a singer, you're told that if you want to hit a high note, then think of it as below you. Be over the note and sing down to the high note. Don't look up to it and yell. You think of it as down below. Works like a charm. If somebody uses the N-word on me, I don't look up at them and break out into tears and write an op-ed about it. I look down. I think you did that. And 99 times out of 100, the reason they did that is because they don't have as many chips. And importantly, I felt that way when I was 8. This is not, oh, he's a professor and a writer, he's different. I'm not different. I certainly wasn't different when I was 8. I thought if that's where you're going to go, little me in 1974, I thought, then you kind of suck. You look down on that person. What I'm saying right now is not strong. It's not Republican. It's not conservative. It is perfect common sense that any trained therapist would teach normal people. But there's a certain strain of Black person that teaches that when it comes to race, things are different. And we are the most delicate of creatures. I'm repulsed by it. And that's the problem. I want white people to maybe help us do the sorts of things that we can do to make real differences in the lives of real people, instead of engaging in this pitying kabuki that passes as political activism in the 21st century.
Okay, so let me check in with our fact checkers really quickly. Allison, Priya, do you have any fact checks for us?
Currently, we do not have any fact checks that we're working on right now. I would like to remind the audience that if they have any fact checks that they would like us to look into, that they can request those via the Q&A function.
You can also submit them by commenting on Facebook. And I actually do have one that came way of the panelist conversation. I wanted to provide some data comparing. It was difficult to compare because we were being asked to compare elderly people and their rates and the positivity rate versus people of color. What I did find from the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, it shows that hospitalization among Black or African-American persons is 3.7% higher than of white people. And the death rate is 2.8% higher. And how that compares to elderly folks is that folks above 65 are 5% higher to be, and this is all races, this is just by age. Folks above 65, again, are 5% higher to be and likely to be hospitalized. And the death rate is 90% higher for those folks 65 and older. So I hope that helps verify. There was also a comment in the Q&A asking for the panelists to comment on why no public figures have talked about how the positivity rate in Illinois has changed. I was actually able to verify that, in fact, Illinois, for the majority of the pandemic, the rates in which people of color were infected by the coronavirus were higher and have recently dropped. I found a news article from the Washington Post that did verify and that did speculate that the reason why recently folks of color have dropped below and now it is folks who are higher is because the virus is now spread into rural areas where more white people and non-people of color live in Illinois. Thank you, Denisha, and we'll be sure to let you know if we have any other fact checks.
Thank you, Allison. So Kmele, let's explore the idea that Blacks were not the only victims of slavery. So you stated in the article that had slavery not existed, the entire country would have been more prosperous. Specifically, you said, think of all the brilliant Africans who were imported to this country by force and pressed into service, and their progeny, which must have included a couple of Einsteins who were never allowed to achieve anything, were robbed of opportunity. You went on to say, the injury is all of ours, it's collective, it belongs to the country. What is the nature of the injury that our country has experienced as a result of slavery, and how do you propose we address this collective injury?
Yeah, and I believe that was actually a quote from something that I said on the podcast at some point. And I'll say that I was being figurative. And when I said that the injury belongs to, I was disembodying this injury. I was saying that as compared to saying that this is an injury that has happened to Black people. It is fairly common to hear people talk about slavery and Jim Crow and redlining, and to talk about the suffering associated with those very bad realities in the aggregate, and to wear it today themselves. And that sort of appropriation of suffering is something that has never really sat well with me. And I believe in that context, I was suggesting that there's probably a better way to think about this. To the extent we want to talk about it in that way, I think it's fair to say that there is a collective injury, that the country, had it never had subjugated labor, and had it never had to fight brutal, bloody, expensive civil war, had we never effectively been taken over by, even today, the persistent conversation about race and racial injustice and the legacy of slavery, I think it is just necessarily true that we could have been far more prosperous. I think that is the general spirit of what I was getting at. But I think there's also something else here, that there is some sort of amelioration that to happen because of suffering and because of that history, because of the injustice of having taken away and having the ability to benefit and prosper. And know that there is a remedy that I would propose. In fact, I think the best thing that we can do with a historical reality like that, the deprivations have happened in the past and that they had material consequences for people in the past and that they have complicated but real effects on us in the present. And I think it's important to underscore that they're complicated. They're real, but they are all complicated. It's really difficult to tell the degree to which past injustice is responsible for, disproportionate crime amongst racial groups. But the better way to think about these things is with respect to the harm that they cause to individuals today. And with respect to history, the better way to think about this is with an acknowledgement of just how complex the historical milieu that we come out of is. Slavery has existed all over the world. It is an institution that's older than writing. Slavery persisted longer in South America than it did in the United States, and in far greater proportion. For anyone who argues that what's the United States exception is its history of slavery, it would be the case that what makes Brazil is its history of slavery. And if slavery made the United States exceptional, then Brazil should be far more exceptional. And it doesn't wash. It is an historical claim, and it's something that I encounter far frequently. So I think that was the context for those kinds.
And I think some people could probably show a correlation between those that identify as Black in Brazil who were descendants of slaves and those in the United States who were descendants of slaves as well. Maybe that's our next conversation. We don't have to approach that right here. But let me, Batya, are there any more questions from the audience?
Yes, we have a lot more questions. All right, let's start with this one. So John, you spoke about a lack of low-level lived experience with racism. And Kmele, you shared that you don't identify as Black, at least not capital letter B Black. Do you feel that your ability to move beyond the kind of Black identity that Issac was describing is a function of other privileges? To put it a different way, do you think that a young Black person from a poor background would be as free to ignore that aspect of their identity? And there was another question that say a very similar vein. What role does class play in relation to race? So I really want you to answer, so I'm going to pause and let you answer it, and then I'll come back with the question for Issac.
Kmele, your answer to this is going to be more interesting than mine. So I'm just going to say, because what that person really means is, how dare you say that you're not Black? But I'm going to say for myself that it's very simple. Poor Black people very often feel the same way as Kmele and me. And how do I know? Because I have relatives, like any Black person does. And like any Black person, most of my relatives have not had the kind of life that I've had. I know them. And they're not the only Black people I know who aren't upper middle class / upwardly mobile. And I have never felt strange in the views that I have. What a lot of you have been taught is that the Black view is the view roughly of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I can see why you think that, because if you watch MSNBC and if you read the New York Times op-ed page, it seems like that's the way any Black person thinks, except for the occasional peculiar renegade like Ward Connerly, or, I suppose now it's us. That's simply not true. If you go to gatherings of, I hate to use that word ordinary, but Black people who are not on MSNBC, Black people who go to church, just Black people, Black folks, you would find that the sorts of views that are considered the devil's spawn on the pages of Salon are perfectly ordinary. And no, not just the occasional grouchy conservative getting on in years Baptist preacher, not just him, ordinary people. There's nothing strange about us, nothing strange at all. Now, Kmele's idea about identity and the labels, he and I have had at the very table I'm sitting at, very polite conversations about how we differ a little bit on that. But no, the reason that I feel this way is not because I'm an upper middle class, private school educated college professor who writes for The Atlantic, who doesn't experience enough racism. You could get the exact same view with a good, strong Black accent from somebody who grew up on the street.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with much all of that. I will say that it can be expensive to be a heterodox lowercase b Black person, there is a social cost to be it. There are expectations that people have for you, not being able to seem authentically Black in different spaces, to invoke the title of Juan's many books, can be very challenging. And I do think you need a certain amount of resiliency to be willing to do that in different spaces. But I think that's very different than recognizing that the biological and genetic basis for something like race is fraud. And acknowledging that most of what we talk about when we talk about race is this sort of politicality, and knowing you actually entitled to completely opt out of that, at least yourself. You certainly can't control the way other people perceive you, but you can definitely control the way you perceive yourself, whether or not you think of yourself as first and foremost a Black person, or whether you recognize the humanity of all people first and foremost fundamentally, and acknowledge that a lot of the shorthand and conventions that depend upon the seen reality of racial identity as we experience it in our everyday lives is a bit, it's an abstraction. It is a shortcut for us to try and make our way in the world, and that there are quite a few things that are really important that it makes just harder to tease out. And I think anyone can embrace that for themselves. I don't think it's likely to be imposed upon them by the outside world, certainly not in 2020. I think if you'd asked me this question in 1964, that this would have been much harder. But at a minimum, I do have Zora Neale Hurston, who I can point to, who lived through far more difficult periods in America than I did, and did not imagine herself as a disadvantaged Black person, who specifically said that she had to abandon race pride because she didn't believe that it made any sense whatsoever to venerate Black people for their accomplishments because they happened to be Black like she was, any more than it made her to feel shame because some Black person had done something dastardly. And in much the same respect, a white person or a Jewish person can't imagine themselves as sort of superior to other people because of Einstein's accomplishment. Einstein's accomplishment don't belong to you. My accomplishment don't belong to you unto our happening to look somewhat alike. And if you need that as a source of pride, then I would charge you to do something about that defect. I think there's something very backwards about that. And that is amongst important things that I could give to someone, that this trend towards encouraging race pride and thinking, again, primarily about ourselves and others in this racial milieu is toxic and retrograde in ways that are somewhat insidious, but are rather obvious when you actually start to contemplate this in a deliberate way.
Batya, you had one more question for Isaac.
I do. And in the meantime, a really good one came through for John that I have to pose to him because it's really good. Isaac, so this question is, it's general, but it's also very specific. What is expected collectively from white people from the anti-racist point of view? What is it that you need from us? That's how the question was phrased. And a second one that's quite related to that is, do you think that being anti-racist is compatible with being ideologically conservative, libertarian, or moderate, rather than progressive or left?
My short, is that I always answer that question. At least by actually trying to tell the person that I can't answer that question. Simply because I sort of actually need to know in terms of how, what their interests are, what their talents are, and also that frankly, what kind of level of willingness is there, kind of like in the person like who was like asking the question, like in order to actually be able to like actually affect change. Like which means like sometimes that you actually have to be sort of like uncomfortable, etc. Like or sort of like even sort of like sacrifice things that you might like, etc. I mean, yes, and so like for me, that like this is not a broad sort of like one size fits all for Black people, white people, or sort of like anybody else. Yes, I mean for sure. Yes, and don't. Well, yes, and also though that like let me just say this as well, that like from my point of view, yes, in terms of sort of like actually yes, in terms of at least like actually loving your Blackness is not a defect. And also that there is sort of like nothing wrong with being Black and saying that I am Black and I'm proud like James Brown or like anything else. Yes, like, and in fact, at least for some Black people in some areas, even in like even in sort of like even sort of like right now, kind of like in like this year, yes, in terms of that, like there sort of like actually have been, at least like in terms of that, some of us like who sort of actually have been so beaten down, at least by sort of like racial stereotypes and so-called microaggressions and racial disparities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, in terms of that, like it is sort of like actually sort of like even sort of actually sort of actually made us a bit ashamed of ourselves and our Blackness. Like which is like something that I have like struggled with here in South Carolina for a very, very, very long time. Yes, and so like for me, these like actually, when we are actually trying to express, you know, pride and hope, etc. Yes, in terms of that, like we are sort of actually trying to at least like actually push back, at least like against some really, really ugly, deeply rooted things. And yes, yes, and like yes, and like also sort of like lastly, I'm gonna like yes, in terms of that, like I sort of actually do not have a problem at least like actually with folks like who actually choose a different route simply because their experiences and backgrounds are different. Like yes, in terms yes, and then that like if you actually sort of actually do not like actually need that kind of Black pride stuff like in order to be your best self, that is fine, that is cool. Like I have absolutely no problem with it at all. Like my only problem sort of actually comes in is sort of like whereas that you actually try to say that like I should actually do your thing, and it, yes, and then that I am saying that I yes, in terms of that, simply because I am different from you, yes, and then so therefore I need something different than you.
So
yeah,
go ahead.
Just to respond briefly, I mean, I certainly understand the perspective, I think, and I should acknowledge, or at least want to acknowledge plainly, that there is a history of people feeling deep shame associated with their racial identity. And it is certainly the case that Black racial pride, notion, say, Black power, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, that this was in response to decades, centuries worth of racial degradation. My perspective, however, is that this is in fact an overcorrection, and that the same impulse that most of us have when we see manifestations of white racial pride, this pride in the unearned, in something you happen to be, as opposed to something you fundamentally are, that it is possible for something to be something that you shouldn't be ashamed of. And for precisely the reasons you shouldn't be ashamed of it, for it to be something that you perhaps shouldn't necessarily take any pride in. I am proud of a great many things that I happen to be, and I find sources of pride in any number of things that I happen to accomplish. I don't see any particular value in deriving pride from this ephemeral thing, this notion of thinking about group differences that was concocted by slavers for the purposes of helping to promote their institution. And I don't want to preserve it. I would rather see it go away. And I think that we can perhaps expedite that process by vacating these old systems of thinking. And if we're going to do something revolutionary, if we're going to spend 2020 and beyond thinking about radical new ways to reimagine ourselves and our relationships with one another, then perhaps we could do something genuinely bold and recognize the incredible quality that we all have as individuals that is completely separate from any ephemeral characteristics that you might have, and is actually meaningful and tangible, as opposed to being stuck in a construct that was built for a different time. And I think we can go beyond that.
Yes, and again, though, that at least like actually, again, yes, yes, in terms of Ellie, and then that just because you don't need it, and also sort of that you sort of actually don't see value in it. Yes, in terms of like actually, it does not mean that there isn't value for a lot of people. Yes, like, and because for a lot of folks like who have sort of actually struggled against these kinds of issues, for a lot of folks, yes, in terms of yes, in terms of sort of like actually holding fast, it's like actually to this identity, like is not about it's like actually being stuck. Like it is an active choice every single day. Yes, yes, and again, like for me, for each individual, yes, in terms of that, like my sort of like goal, kind of like is for you to get sort of like whatever it is that you need. At least like in order to at least to like actually live your best life. And I am okay, at least like actually with knowing that your road is different than mine. Like I am perfectly fine with that. I'm like, and yet though, but yet, yes, like, and yes, like, and also that just because I have chosen a different road, it does not mean that I am not also a free thinker or free or loving or sort of prideful of other things that I have and do, sort of actually with my wife and my kids and my job and everything else. Yes, like all of those other things, like, yes, like I have joys and pains, etc. Like which like actually might have sort of absolutely nothing to do with race. That is absolutely true. Yet though that at least for me, kind of like on this issue that like it has helped me. At least to like actually keep on working hard and like, yes, like, and also to like actually not lose faith.
Right. So let me hop in really quickly. I'm gonna start winding our program down for tonight, but there's one thing I want to get a little personal with you all. So I was raised by two parents who grew up in the height of the civil rights movement, grew up in the 40s and 50s in the Deep South. And one thing that they always taught me was, you belong anywhere anybody else belongs. And don't believe the lie that people have told you or that people are gonna try to tell you about who you are. And so I know that each of us have something in common, and that's that we are all parents. And so I want to explore really quickly. I teach my children how to maneuver through this world. And some of that conversation has to do with race, but it also has to do with character building and education and all of that. How do you all teach your children to maneuver and move through this world?
No. Denisha, I understand completely what you mean, but no maneuvering.
No maneuvering. Okay,
no.
Correct
my
me.
My children are biracial. Their mother is white, and they are therefore what used to be called mixed kids. I do not believe in 2020 that they need to identify explicitly as African American. I would have said that they needed to 40 years ago, but I think things are changing. They're going to be this new thing called biracial. But to the extent that anybody may look down on them because they're brown rather than white, I'm not sure exactly how these things are going to go, because America changes so deeply every 5 years that I think the sorts of things that Denisha, you and I, Kmele, you and I have gone through being taught, it's going to be a different world even 10 years from now when the two of them come of age. Mine are 5 and 8. But I just hope to be teaching them that what's interesting about them is their individuality. And therefore, they will be armed with, if somebody calls them a name or has a stereotype they're going to aim against them, they won't have any inkling that they're supposed to think that that somehow sums them up, or to take a page from Kmele, that they're supposed to start thinking about slavery and Jim Crow and redlining when somebody says something to them in 2030. No, I want them to think of themselves as individuals. And it won't do for a Black person to say, my children know they're individuals, but they're Black first. Because what that translates into is that somebody's going to say the N-word and they're going to fall to pieces. No. Both of my girls are a little mouthy at this point. They do what would have been considered talking back when I was young. And I think to myself, they would be in next week if they dealt with my parents. And yet I think to myself, part of that mouthiness of theirs is genuine pride. And I hope it will save me from the day that one of them comes home from school spouting all of this modern anti-racist horse crap. It would tear me to pieces to find one of my children affected by this backwards way of thinking.
Fair enough. Kmele?
My daughter's 3, so most of my advice when it comes to navigating the world is pretty basic. Don't touch that, is what I tell her frequently. But I have thought a lot about how she might imagine herself and the lessons that I hope to teach her about how to imagine herself. I've thought a lot less actually about the kind of spears that'll be chucked at her. But certainly as you're mentioning it, I mean, it is entirely possible that some people will meet her, and as a function of her physical appearance, her I don't know, cappuccino colored skin, someone might say, oh, I don't like you and you're not good enough. The truth, however, is that there are any number of reasons why someone might say something like that to her. And equipping a child with the tools necessary to exist in a world that isn't always friendly amongst people who don't always have your best interests at heart, and to still have confidence in the face of that. I mean, I think that's something that every parent really has to grapple with. One of the sort of popular notions these days are that, Black parents are sitting down and having a talk with their young Black men. And it may be the case that many of them are. I can't say that my parents ever did have such a talk with me. We did talk about sort of respect for authority. We do talk about sort of being safe in general, related to other things. but never any sort of expressions of particular concern because of the awful things that they've experienced. And, you know, I was raised by a man who went to high school before Brown v. Board of Education, and who played semi-professional football in the days before the NFL was fully integrated. And he didn't see it as necessary for me to think of myself as sort of Black first, or to sort of codify the various things about the world with respect to, you know, the way the world is for Black people and white people. It's not to say those conversations never happened, but it wasn't a principal piece of what he gave me. What he gave me was self-esteem and pride, and understanding that there are people out there who might not want you to succeed, and you'll have to navigate that, which I think I'm doing okay.
Excellent. Isaac, really quickly.
Yes, and at least for me, like I sort of, one that I sort of actually have not had the talk like actually with my kids either, that they are 16 and 19. Yes, like, and that is because like I sort of like actually just want them to be able to focus on things that they can control. Like, which means that like if there is a bad cop out there, like who actually happens upon them and like actually does some bad stuff, that frankly, unfortunately, that like there sort of like isn't like anything that they can do, et cetera. At least like about that. I'm a yes, and then so like for me, like my focus like actually for like my kids like actually sort of actually have been like sort of like what my mom did for me, and that like she she like pretty much says figure it out, period, like figure it out. I'm a yes, and then that like even with this severe stutter, like even with our poverty, like even with the domestic violence that we dealt with, like even with the, like our diagnostic, et cetera, like all those sort of things, like her sort of like focus like was to figure it out, like no matter what the situation is, like which I have like also sort of like as you taught my kids, like which is like part of the reason why that my 19-year-old son like actually sort of actually did not crumble. These are actually when these like actually when that yes, in terms of, and then that I'm like these like actually when he was like actually called out these sort of N-word recently. I'm like at college, my answer actually by like this white roommate. Yes, and then that like he actually handled like the entire thing. Yes, and then a week later, yes, and then that he actually told me about it. I'm like, yes, and so like for me, like I just in terms of like that, like I sort of like actually just want them to know like who they are through and through. Yes, like, and also that like my struggle, frankly, is to like actually sort of like actually leave them space. At least like in order to like at least like a at least for them to like actually figure out these issues like actually for themselves, like even if they end up disagreeing with me like on the issue of race, anti-racism, et cetera, or whatever, that I sort of actually want them actually just to like actually be able to walk their path.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm gonna close us out this evening. I think we have one more fact check from Allison. Allison, can you give us that fact check really quickly?
Yes, Tanisha, I will do my best to be quickly. There was a claim in the chat that for every Black person that is murdered, there's also a white person that is murdered by the police without any data. So we found some some data to support the fact that that is not true. We did find a study from the National Violent Death Reporting System. All fatalities resulting from the use of lethal force by on-duty law enforcement. In 17 US states we're examining using this data, victims were majority white at 52%, but disproportionately Black. So based on the population of Black people and the amount of people that have died at the hands of police, it is in fact a higher rate for Black people. And Priya actually has one really quickly as well to share based on that same data. There was also something in the chat that was describing this. So I'm hopeful that this fact check will check all of those boxes here.
Yeah, to continue with that, we found a study from the United States Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that states that Black men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police over their lifetime than white men are. And also that Black women are about 1.4 times more likely to be killed by police than white women are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, sir.
Very quickly.
Yes,
That disproportion, thank you, folks. Those are very important data, but that disproportion statistic is well known. I wouldn't say something like what I said without being aware of it, but the thing is, you have to factor in two things. One is that unfortunately, and for reasons I think a lot of us could understand, Black men commit a disproportionate number of crimes. Now, we can talk about why. It has nothing to do with blame, but that's part of that disproportion. And also, you have to factor in the issue of poverty. And this is a Kmele kind of point. Poverty makes you more likely to encounter the cops. And get this, Black people are 2.5% more likely to be poor than whites. Do you see the matchup there? And so the police murder statistic and the poverty statistic match up perfectly. If you factor in those things, it's utterly insupportable that the cops are killing out of even subtle racist animus. So that disproportion is there, but racism doesn't happen to be the only possible explanation for it.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I'm going to go ahead and wind us down this evening. I would like to say thank you to each of you. We did have over 600 people on here tonight, so we didn't get to every single question that we wanted to get to, but I'm hoping maybe at some point we can all get together, brothers, and have another conversation. Even you, Kmele, have another conversation about poverty and race and class, because I think that all goes into this. And Issac, hear about your personal and your family's interaction with the criminal justice system, which we could read about in your book, My Brother Moochie. And so hopefully we can get together again and have another conversation. So thank you so much to Issac, Bailey, Kmele Foster, and John McWhorter on a lively and informative conversation. And again, I would like to thank our program committee, our roving reporter, Batya from The Forward. Thank you so much for writing this piece, and thank you so much for serving as our roving reporter. Thank you to our fact checkers, Allison and Priya, and the staff of The Forward and American Public Square for their contribution to tonight's program. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a link to a short post-event survey. Please take a moment to complete this survey. It helps guide us as we plan future programs. Again, American Public Square relies on support from its members to maintain excellent programming. We're committed to our model now more than ever as we seek actionable common ground following the 2020 election and amidst an unprecedented global pandemic. Now through the end of the year, we're offering a holiday membership match. So anyone who purchases a new or renewed membership receives a free membership to give to a family member or friend. So we hope that those of you who are not yet members will take the opportunity tonight to officially join us. You can find information on our website at americanpublicsquare.org. I also want to make you aware of a very special offer from The Forward for tonight's viewers. You can receive 6 months worth of The Forward for just $10, and so that's 67% savings off the standard price. You can access this offer again from our American Public Square webpage. Thank you for being here tonight. We hope that you will join us again soon, and I hope you have a safe and healthy week. Good night. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.